Well, good evening, everybody. It's I, Nick, Pennsylvania. I'm here with my good friend, Brendan Bond. Good evening, Brendan.
Good evening, Nick.
And Brendan has a story for us. It's been a little while. We do want to thank everybody that's reached out. There's been a lot of positive feedback about some of these this little series of Ghost Lights, which is kind of half the length of our typical episodes, around 25 minutes to half an hour, and I've heard nothing but positive things. We do have a couple stories, a couple interviews that are going to be coming up. We're very excited for those. I know I am excited because I was talking to a friend of ours who has contributed some emails and whatnot to the show, who was remembering more of one of my favorite stories that happened to him. And I hope we can have Chris on soon. And I know he's listening and he heard that. So hopefully that's just more pressure for us to get that locked down.
Right. I love it.
So, without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to you. I know you've got kind of a story. I believe it's a folk custom of sorts. I remember you had asked me about this, and I thought it had something to do with English Morris dancing, but I wasn't entirely sure.
Yeah.
What are we talking about tonight?
Yeah, well, you knew more than I did initially. So, what we're going to be talking about tonight is an English folk custom called Jack in the Green. So, this was something that I had been kind of clued into by one of my friends who's a regular listener. She sent it over to me and she was just like, "Hey, have you seen this wild thing?" And it was this video of all these folks over in England dressed up. A lot of them were in like suits, but had tons of like leaves and garlands and plants and flowers. And they were kind of like going like door to door and everything. Then out of one of the doors came this. The only way I can describe it in this video was, imagine if someone was dressed as a Christmas tree. It was a very like conically shaped, like almost like Wicker Man type get up with a person in the middle kind of thing. And everyone was like cheering and it just looked like a very jovial event. Like it looked like it was weird, it looked like a good time, and I was like, these vibes, this looks like something I'm going to be interested in. So I watched that video and a few other ones, and I kept seeing this term Jack in the Green, because when I first saw it, I'm like, oh, this is some kind of like Green Man tradition, that I just have never heard of, but it kept being referred to as Jack in the Green. And I was like, okay, well, let me look into this and see what's going on. I didn't spend 3 minutes before I was like, oh, there's a lot going on here, more than I anticipated.
I have to say, a lot of English folk customs are wonderfully bizarre and convoluted.
Right.
And I'm guessing, like, learning some about the history of, say, like, Punch and Judy shows.
Right.
Like, there is so much going on. It's wonderfully bizarre, but again, there seems to be a constant conflict. It seems like so many English folk traditions are really shouted, not in that there isn't a lot of information, but that there is so much disparate information. At least that's the impression I've gotten.
Yeah, no, you're not wrong. Because again, like I went into this thinking like, oh, this is some kind of like modern, like Green Man neo-pagan tradition. But then I started seeing all these like old, like not lithograph, whatever is pre-lithograph prints, like woodblock prints and stuff.
Sure.
From like the 1700s, and I was like, oh, there's more here than what I anticipated. So like once I started looking into it, this is kind of the stuff that I learned is, so Jack in the Green, like we said, it's this English folk custom, and it's associated with May Day celebrations, which is kind of like it's the
kind of the welcoming the summer,
Yeah, there are May Day traditions all over the world, and lots of different. I feel like every culture really has them.
Of course, there's the maypole in like Bavaria. If you see the blue white striped poles and the raising of it,
right? Yeah, so there's lots of different traditions and customs that kind of like seem to like ebb and flow through different cultures and spaces. So it fits in that, like it's in that realm. It's very different than like stuff that happens in like the fall and winter. So yeah, it's this big like tree-shaped dude or wicker man that is either paraded around or like is led through the town in like a procession. It's one of these many other like processional type things. And there's often musicians, there's often like accompanying people that are also dressed up in different ways that are like, leading this green man or just this Jack in the Green along. So it's a big like parade type thing. I think the first thing that it reminded me of was when you see like the Krampusnacht stuff over in Finland or the Wren Boys stuff in
Yep.
Ireland or
Germany, I know there's big brass festivals around
mm,
Sylvester, and
yeah.
that's in Der Schweiz, Switzerland, and
Okay.
they're supposed
Yeah.
to like the brass bands, and they dress all crazy. They look. It's
hmm
like if you've ever been to Philadelphia for the Mummers Parade,
I
it's a
was
bit
just about
like
to
that.
say. Yeah. And yeah, it's because it has that vibe of it of like that's why I thought of the mumming too, because that's almost has like the play element to it. Like
Yeah,
there's a bit of a story, a bit of an act going on. And
music and
re-
wild garb.
right. That's yeah, those are two like the big things
Which,
that are
an
always going
aside,
on.
really quickly, I feel like the whole Mummers thing in Philadelphia is one of those things that not enough people are aware of happening. I feel that's been kind of closely guarded by the people of Philly.
Really? See, I thought that was like a big deal.
It
Like,
was
well, I guess,
something
or at
I'm
least
always
known.
surprised.
Yeah.
I'm always surprised by how few people are aware of it. And again, being kind of,
Huh.
I'm, I'm a fairly known entity in the banjo world, and it's a big banjo event, kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm always
Well,
surprised by how few people seem to know about it.
oh, we might have to
That's a
do a
total aside.
yeah. Well, we might have to do a Mummers Parade specific episode then. We'll have to look into that, just so people appreciate what we have here. But yeah, so there's a lot of things that it sounds akin to like one of the again for instance I thought of too. Are you familiar with the whole Wren Boys stuff in Ireland that folks do?
I am not. Is Ren short for Renaissance in this case?
No, it's Wren is in
Because of
like the
course we have that
like the
huge.
bird.
Oh, WREN.
Yeah, and that's like
Okay.
that's different because it's December 26th. It's like
I was gonna
the
say
day
if
after
you were gonna say
Christmas.
Ren Boys out here, there's that giant Renaissance festival
Right.
right by us, and for those of you who
Oh,
don't have such a
yeah.
thing, there are times of the year where we're inundated by people eating turkey legs and dressed up, and they have their own culture with them, and
hmm
it's some of it's highly questionable.
Some of it's definitely high questionable, but it's funny because you'll be standing like in line at a gas station or something, and
Yeah.
you'll have a dude in front of you in like not full armor, but like more armor than you normally have at a gas
Right.
station.
That or more Harlequin stylings than
Right.
I'm accustomed to. But
Right. Yeah.
so anyway, coming back to the Jack and the
Yes.
Green. Sorry for
Yes.
that
Yeah.
tangent.
No, it was all good. No, the mumming is a big part of it. I think so. In a lot of the information that you see when you first kind of look at this is that it's this May Day celebration specifically that was first really heavily documented in the 1700s, which is that's going back a bit. That's a legitimate tradition in most places, and looks like what it involved initially, because again, a lot of these things move and grow over time, and it started with milkmaids actually parading through town. They would have flowers and everything. There was a lot of them carrying silver, like these like silver I guess not chalices, but just different silver like drinking vessels and whatnot, and just kind of going place to place and like you mentioned earlier, Nick, a lot of revelry and rabble rousing, I guess. It's just again with this May Day traditions, it's very much a celebration. Doesn't have like as much of a point as some of the other things that might be out there. What you see is you see this documentation in the 1700s and everything, and it takes lots of different forms. With along with the milkmaids, after the 1780s, you start to see a lot of chimney sweeps specifically that start taking part in these parades. And just to be clear, this isn't like all of England it seems like there are places all around now that do it, but this mainly seemed to be happening around the Kent area that we've talked about before, like kind of that south central England area.
Right.
But so you see the chimney sweeps, bunters as well, taking part in this. They start dressing like milkmaids in the late 1700s. So you already have this transition of people doing something that harkens back to just less than 100 years previously. So you're starting to see this transition already and everything, it looks like. And it seems like why the chimney sweeps initially got involved was there was actually a law passed around chimney sweeps. Are you familiar with this?
I am not. I
Yes,
know
yes.
I know precious little about chimney sweeps. The only I'm trying to imagine what sort of laws one could pass at this time because I'm imagining, I mean, child labor is still a nascent concern, and
Mm-hmm.
of course, a chimney, getting up on the roofs. I'm trying to think if these laws have to deal with their hours of operation or if there's like some sort of blue laws essentially that say no chimney sweeping on Tuesdays or I can only imagine what sort of ordinances surround the guild of sweeping.
Um, well, it actually you actually did have to register. That was one of the
Well,
parts of it.
sure, we can't just let anybody up
Yeah,
on those roofs.
right. And it basically ended up creating a lot of problems, I guess, for it disrupted that industry and made the chimney sweeps much more sympathetic, I guess, to people because what would happen with a lot of these times is people would go around and they would basically kind of like try and get like free drinks or try and get stuff from people. Some of it was donations, and it was all about prosperity and the coming of summer and everything.
So are they going door to door or are they just parading down the streets? Because with like the drink thing,
Looks like both.
I was gonna
Yeah,
say it kind of sounds like the tradition of wassailing and whatnot.
it has some parallels there. It seems like in some of these like woodcuts, they are going like door to door or going from like basically like almost like a big bar crawl, like one to another. Other times they are taking place in very public places, going from like one square to the other. There's just, a lot of different variants over, especially these first like 200 years from the early 1700s to the late 1800s. And the early 1900s is when it originally starts to kind of peter out. And it's kind of conjectured that happens for a few reasons. And it isn't so much that the May Day festivals stop, it's just that these Jack in the Green parts kind of gets it seems like almost gets supplanted a little bit by other acts, like you were mentioning the maypoles, other things like that. So there's not a lot of great documentation on like why it kind of peters out, but it does. So in the late 1900s, though, we start to see a resurgence in this Jack in the Green. And a lot of folks attribute that to a lot of like modern paganism and revivals in that, and especially in England at the time.
Oh,
Um,
sure, like your Stonehengers and all that.
right, and that's where you see a lot of these early kind of Green Man parallels to that archetype. And to be clear, the Green Man is something that is like recognized by a lot of different cultures, traditions, and religions in a few different ways. So we're going to be speaking in very blanket terms here. And it's basically imagine this as a face made out of leaves, almost is how I usually see it a lot of places.
Yeah, and I have a question because I mean it started with milkmaids having parades in and around May Day, and then
Yeah.
other trades people,
Hmm.
particularly chimney sweeps, coming in. At what point are they dressing up like a tree of sorts? Where did
So
that come in? Because I think I
so
missed that.
Yeah, so no, that's a good question. You're starting to get to the root of the problem here, that there may be some cross-contamination in some of these stories and the lineage. So you see it early on in the late 1800s specifically, or late 1700s specifically, because what you end up seeing is you have these milkmaids that decorate their chalices and everything with flowers, and that grows into garlands, and then the garlands end up leading to the whole kind of Wicker Man structure that gets paraded around. Because in some of these lithographs from especially the late 1700s, you see it as something that's almost like carried, you know, by a bunch of people. Sometimes it is just placed somewhere. It almost looks just like a someone put a Christmas tree, for lack of a better term, somewhere, and everyone's kind of having a party around it and everything. So it's not a clear this happens, then this happens, then this happens. It seems like there is kind of a lot churning through all these different traditions. And what you're kind of picking up on, like I said, is where we start to see some of the questions. And this is kind of what, again, initially caught my attention is you have this folklorist in the early 1900s named Lady Raglan, Raglan.
I've heard that name.
Yeah, like she published a lot of stuff from what it from what it seems like in the early 1900s. And in 1939, she published an article saying specifically that the Jack in the Green tradition was a holdover from pre-Christian Green Man traditions, saying it wasn't a new thing at all. And she and other folks kind of link this to fertility gods that were again like pre-Christian as well. And then you have a few other folklorists throughout the 1900s, one named Christina Hole, kind of tying all of these Jack and the Green traditions to pre-Christian pagan traditions.
Now, I'm curious of what evidence they provided that, because, as you said, looking at lithographs and prints from the 18th century, it's more of a garlanded thing. It's not someone dressed up
Yes,
so much. So, where are they getting that?
it seems like what their argument is basically made in is there are Green Man like looking carvings in certain old churches in England. Um,
Okay.
and as we'll get to in a little bit here, obviously there are like very plain Green Man traditions in other countries, you
You
know?
were just
Yeah.
saying as much.
So basically, so it seems like a lot of their argument was, oh, well, we have Green Man motifs that are pre-Christian. We have Green Man motifs in other countries. Therefore, this is a Green Man. Very quickly, I came across a lot of information that didn't seem to support that as much. So I kind of want to look at what the kind of agreed upon history of the very specific Jack in the Green tradition kind of is. Starting mainly in the 1700s, like we said, we have the milkmaids and everything, and we have these plates and everything. We have these engravings that do show up, especially in the late 1700s, because there's references to this stuff happening in the early 1700s. But we actually have physical engravings and stuff from the late 1700s. We have reports that are printed in journals and everything. There was a relatively famous one where you have the Prince of Wales attending a masquerade at the Pantheon in London, and there was a Jack in the Green procession happening there and everything. So this wasn't like it was just happening in little towns in Kent. This was a very popular thing at the time.
Yeah, because it's come out of the province and into the
Into the
capital
main
city.
into the mainstream. Yeah, I mean that's about as mainstream as you get right there at the time, I think. And like I said, we have these documented references and everything at the time of it being a Jack in the Green, like it's basically the modern version. And it seems like folklorists can say like, okay, yeah, before that we have the chimney sweeps dressing up like milkmaids with a bunch of flowers, and before that we have documentation of the milkmaids with the flowers. It's very kind of one, two, three, in a lot of places. So that seems to be relatively agreed upon. And then, like we mentioned earlier, with the chimney sweeps in the late 1800s, things just kind of eventually fell out of favor in the early 1900s. If I had to guess, I'd say it was probably like just like a time and sensibility thing. Like it was probably just like it is now. It seems like it was probably a very rowdy tradition. And when I think of early 1900s England, I don't think of rowdy public displays being like in vogue. Um, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe
I'm
I'm
gonna say
wrong.
you're wrong, but I get it really depends on where you're
Yeah,
at,
I
I
guess it
suppose.
does. Yeah. But so
Not everyone's Bertie Wooster out there.
it's true. So like we said, we do have this more modern revival. There are some relatively, not like, I wouldn't say like famous, but there are some like established troops that like do this. Like there's one that's called the Motley Morris Troupe, that
I
perform.
knew Morris Dancing was going to get
See,
some
yeah,
Morris side was going to get
right.
into this somewhere.
Yeah, that's in Rochester. There's a few other that kind of pop up all over England, and now there's actually some in America. Looking at the like the listing and everything that they show on some of these sites. Looks like there's probably about 24 places that have these pretty regularly. It's definitely around. But so that's kind of like the long and short of like the agreed upon documented kind of history. What you have in the late 1900s, along with the revival, is like we mentioned, you have folks saying like, "Oh, this is a Green Man tradition and everything." Well, we have folklore, with professional folklorists coming out and basically saying that there's not a lot of actual evidence for that. Some of the folks we're going to talk about that have these writings, one is Roy Judge, did a lot of work on this. Another is Ron Hutton, and there's a few others. This isn't just them working on this stuff. But one of the things that Roy Judge studied, he kind of lays out the timelines, and these are like, again, scholarly articles, so I'm not gonna just read those to you guys. They're a little dense, in my opinion. But basically, he lays out these timelines that we just kind of highlighted, saying like, here's like the things that kind of happened. And he also talks about how there are other things, like we mentioned earlier, like you brought up, Nick, the Mayday poll. There's a lot of things happening with these traditions. And yes, there are other traditions around the world. Like one that he mentions is St. George's Day in Russia that has people dressing up like what we would say looks like green men. In Slovakia, there's Green George that's run the same thing. There's one in Carpathia, one in Transylvania, one in Romania that all look like these kind of like they look like green men.
It's almost like this is one of those universal symbols, almost, where if you really think
Right.
about it, you're kind of limited in the different ways of representation.
Right. Yeah. If you're trying to represent the flowering of the world,
Well, we think like most every culture has a tree-like spirit sort of thing, and this
right.
could even be seen as an analog to that.
hmm Right, right. And what Roy Judge and a few other folks kind of say is like, yes, this does look like a Green Man tradition, but we can't, from like a provenance standpoint, say this is a Green Man tradition because there's not actual documented evidence that goes back to those pre-Christian times
Right,
like there are for some of these other folklore traditions in these other
right.
countries.
It may be people kind of, I mean, people today who are getting into it might be doing it because they're also exploring those things, but there's
Right.
not a continuity.
The continuity isn't necessarily there. And other folklorists, like I mentioned, this Roy Hutton, he's the one who kind of drew the initial connection between like the milkmaids and that whole the garlands and the flowers, and then the buntings and chimney sweeps coming in, imitating the milkmaids, and how it got crazier and crazier. And then you see the Wicker Man stuff coming in after a while. But even Roy Hutton kind of seems to say on a few occasions that like just because we see the milkmaids, we see the flowers, we then see a garland, then we then see this Wicker Man type thing. There was a lot of other things happening at the same time, so that's you can't even really, from a folklore standpoint, draw a this then this then this. It's not like it's an ABC kind of thing.
Right. And also I would say that, and I'm not trying to jump in too much here,
hmm
but I would say that chimney sweeps and milkmaids, who seem to be the progenitors of this tradition, what do these have in common is that these are very working class people. These are can be difficult jobs. These probably
hmm
aren't the most well compensated. And I'm thinking too, like, well, if you're gonna have some sort of parade and you need like you're not gonna go out and buy ribbons for this occasion, but you can make a garland.
Right.
Ivy is pretty readily
hmm
available.
Right. Right. So
Yeah, it seems like necessity, or
Hmm.
probably just the ease and affordability of access to the materials is probably one of the reasons that led them to this costuming.
Right. Like in one of the things that I believe this is from one of Judge's writings, talking about how there's so many different things going on, he got into something that was not originally part of what people now are calling this tradition, which was the wearing basically like just like green hats and stuff like on your head. And what he in one of his writings says, and this is going to be a quote from Judge. He says, to sum up this confusing subjects, when talking about the provenance of all these things, he says, it seems indisputable that there were three kinds of entity: the head-born garland, which was the canopy that never covers the bearer's head, let alone his body; the chair-borne garland, which is like the Wicker Man type thing, which is the same height as the modern jack, but whose weight would have been an impossible burden for one individual. So it needs to have a bunch of people carried. So uh it can't be just
Just
one
worn
guy.
and yeah.
Right. So that's not a covering. That's a very different kind of thing. With the leaf covered framework. And he kind of goes on to say that there may have been intermediate stages between all of these things, but we don't have documentation of them, so we can't say that there's a direct correlation there. I almost think of some of this as looking at like missing link species, almost, where it's like, okay, we see A and we see C, we think B's there, but we don't have B, so you can't say that
So we
B
could
is.
postulate.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
possibly, which is fine, and that kind of leads me to kind of like bring this kind of all around. I think that like whenever you're looking at saying something is an old tradition, we like adding provenance to things, because I think a lot of people seem to think that if there's provenance to it, then it's more valid than otherwise.
Right.
Um,
We wouldn't be doing this silly thing if it weren't so well established.
right. And then you look at it and go like, oh, well, like, is it actually well established? And what a lot of these folklorists seem to also kind of like say that is something that I think is important to remember is like it can still be fun. It can still have a lot of meaning. It can especially still have religious meaning. Like if this isn't a green man tradition from pre-Christian times, that doesn't mean that modern pagans who are doing this, it's not any less or more or less valid. Like that's what they want to do. So like, who cares how old it is? If it's important to them, then like great.
We'll instill the meaning into it.
Right? Yeah. So like folks shouldn't have to feel that they need to justify their beliefs like that. I think. But if we're speaking from a folkloric standpoint with where these traditions come from, I think that this is a great example of why it's important to like cite your sources and actually like draw these conclusions, like show your work. Because like, yes, it does look like an old Green Man tradition. Yes, there are some old Green Man motifs in England and in the surrounding areas. Yes, there are Green Man traditions that go way back in other countries. But if we don't actually have the evidence of them growing from one thing to another, then it's not necessarily a tradition. It's more of just like borrowed motifs. Again, which is fine. There's
Right.
nothing wrong with
Or we're
that, but
just
it's
installing an existing
right,
thing onto something, which is almost kind of like making an excuse, I
right.
feel like.
hmm No, that's a good way of putting it. You're making an excuse where you probably don't really even need to make an excuse. Like you can just do it. It can just be fun.
Yeah.
You can add your own meaning to it, and that's great.
Don't
Um,
don't apologize for liking something, no matter how
right,
silly it is.
right,
I
and
mean, I have how many Adamant records? Come on now.
right. I think it's interesting how much this is probably like a lot of other things that folks don't think of as like a folk tradition, but like the logic of like looking up opposing viewpoints and questioning what is told to you as like history or fact or just taken as a premise, like you should at least look into it, you know? I just think it's interesting, and the fact that we have so much like diversity in these folk traditions, and the fact that it does get convoluted is pretty cool. Like, I'd rather that be the problem we're having, you know?
Yeah, I shouldn't maybe express this, but I'm a little relieved to hear an English folklorist express some frustration and confusion as to some of
Right.
these, because again, I've long been fascinated, and partly through music, obviously, because I've
Hmm.
been mentioning Morris sides, and those of you that aren't aware, Morris is a traditional folk dance and music
Yeah.
of England, and I playing the button accordion. Most of the instruction for button accordion that's in
Hmm.
English is either Celtic or Morris dance. And in fact,
Hmm.
for and not to brag, but until my book came out, the only English instruction on button accordion was for those two things, and a
Right.
little bit of Southwest Norteño stuff. So yeah, but Morris dancing is really interesting. You might look